Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. He didn't just close the distance, he erased it. 1 second I was standing at the kitchen counter, pretending to focus on the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the next his presence was everywhere, behind me, around me, heat pressing into my spine, fingers firm at my waist as if he'd been holding back for far too long. The air shifted, thickened, charged with something that had been waiting for a spark, and behind us, in the doorway, my husband stood still, too still, like a witness to a moment none of us were prepared to name. It hadn't started here. It never does. It started with glances that lingered half a second too long across the dinner table, with hands brushing when passing plates, with the subtle tightening in my chest every time his voice dipped lower, rougher. When he spoke my name, we were adults. We knew better. There are lines you don't cross, especially when vows and shared histories stand like guardrails around your life. But desire is patient. It waits for cracks. That evening, the kitchen light cast everything in gold, marble counters glowing, shadows stretching long across the floor. I remember telling myself to breathe normally, to act normally, even as the silence between us pulsed louder than conversation ever could. My husband had stepped out of the room only minutes before, unaware, or maybe too aware of the storm gathering in the space he left behind. When his hand found my hip, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't cruel either. It was decisive. A silent admission that whatever tension had been building was no longer content to live in stolen glances and careful distance. My palms pressed against the cool stone of the counter, grounding me, even as my pulse betrayed me. His breath grazed the curve of my neck. Not quite a kiss, not quite restraint. A boundary tested but not yet broken. And then my husband returned. I didn't see him at first. I felt the shift, the heaviness in the room, the quiet inhale that wasn't mine. When I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the reflection in the dark kitchen window, there he was, frozen, watching, not intervening, not speaking, just absorbing the scene unfolding in front of him like it was something both unbearable and impossible to look away from. The three of us locked in a moment that stretched endlessly. There was anger there, confusion, but something else too, something far more dangerous. Curiosity, a question hanging unspoken between us. How far would this go? My heart pounded so loudly I was certain they could both hear it. I should have stepped away. I should have said something, anything to shatter the tension coiling tighter around us. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, caught between the man whose hands held me and the man who had promised to. No one moved. The kitchen, once ordinary and safe, had transformed into a battlefield of restraint and temptation. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Every second stretched thin, trembling on the edge of a choice none of us were ready to own. What happens when the person who is supposed to protect you is the one silently witnessing your surrender? What happens when the line between loyalty and longing blurs so completely you can't tell which side you're standing on? I didn't know then whether that moment would destroy us or awaken something we had buried for years. I only knew that as his grip tightened slightly and my husband's gaze darkened, the fragile balance of our lives tilted just enough to make falling feel inevitable. And none of us stepped back. The silence didn't break. It deepened. His hands were still at my waist but the force behind them softened. Not retreating, just shifting. As if he'd suddenly become aware that this wasn't just tension anymore. It was a choice. A dangerous, irreversible one. My husband's voice finally cut through the air, low, controlled. "Are you going to move?" he asked quietly, "or am I supposed to keep watching?" The words weren't loud, but they landed hard. The man behind me didn't answer right away. I felt his breath steady against my neck, slower now, more deliberate. His thumbs brushed lightly against my hips. Not a claim, not surrender either. My pulse stuttered at the smallest movement. That was the worst part. It wasn't force that kept me there. It was the electricity humming between us, alive and undeniable. "I don't think she wants me to move," he said finally. My throat tightened. Both of them were waiting for me. The kitchen light flickered faintly, casting shadows across their faces. I turned my head slightly, enough to see my husband clearly now. His jaw was clenched but his eyes weren't filled with rage. They were searching, trying to read me, trying to understand whether this was betrayal or something we had both been circling without daring to speak. "You don't have to prove anything," my husband said to me, his voice softer now. That almost broke me. Because he was right. I didn't. And yet the heat rising beneath my skin had nothing to do with proving anything at all. It was about being seen. About feeling something raw and immediate instead of safe and predictable. "I'm not proving anything," I whispered. The man behind me leaned closer. But this time his touch was slower, careful. His fingers traced the line of my waist. Not exploring, not crossing lines. Just reminding me he was there. The contact was barely there at all, yet it sent a ripple through me. "You're trembling," he murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. "I know," I breathed. The space between the three of us felt smaller now. My husband stepped forward, just one step, but it changed everything. He wasn't frozen anymore, he was part of it, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him too. "Look at me," he said. I did. There was hurt in his eyes, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of something that mirrored the tension coiled inside me. Not approval, not permission, just awareness, as if he was realizing that whatever this was, it didn't start tonight. It started long before any hands touched skin. The man behind me loosened his grip, not pulling away entirely, giving me space, giving me room to decide. The power shifted in that tiny adjustment. For the first time since this began, I wasn't caught between them. I was standing there because I hadn't moved. My husband reached out slowly, carefully, and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch was achingly familiar, steady, grounding. His knuckles grazed my cheek, and I felt my breath hitch. "Tell me what you want," he said quietly. That question was heavier than anything else in the room, because wanting wasn't the problem. Admitting it was. Behind me, I felt the other man step back half an inch, not far enough to leave, just far enough to make his presence feel intentional rather than overpowering. The restraint only made the tension sharper. 3 adults, 1 kitchen, and a silence filled with words none of us dared to say. "I don't know," I answered honestly, but that wasn't entirely true. I knew I wanted the heat, the spark, the feeling of being desired so intensely it made the air feel thinner. I also knew I wanted the life I had built, the safety, the history. The man standing in front of me, waiting instead of demanding. The conflict twisted inside me, hot and unrelenting. My husband's hand lingered at my cheek a second longer before dropping. He didn't step back. He didn't step forward. Neither did the man behind me. The tension didn't snap. It stretched. And somehow that felt even more dangerous. Because now we were all aware of it. And none of us were pretending anymore. The kitchen air felt heavier now. Almost tangible, like we were inhaling the tension between us. Every heartbeat echoed, loud enough to fill the room. Every small motion charged with possibility. My husband's fingers still hovered near my cheek, hesitant, unsure, yet unwilling to retreat entirely. The man behind me shifted subtly, just a fraction closer than before, enough to remind me he was still there, still waiting, still part of this silent triangle that refused to resolve. I swallowed, feeling the heat climb up my throat. My hands itched to reach out, to close the distance, but my mind screamed caution. We had walls, invisible ones, built over years of promises, fears, and unspoken rules. Crossing them would leave traces we could never erase. And yet the pull was magnetic, undeniable. "You've always had a way of catching me off guard," my husband murmured, not moving closer, not pulling away either. His voice held a low, fragile vulnerability that made my chest ache. The words weren't about desire. They were about history, about every small moment we had shared that led to this precarious point. The man behind me leaned in, his presence brushing against the back of my arm, accidental yet deliberate, just the faintest contact, enough to make my nerves hum and my pulse stutter. I could feel him, even without seeing him fully, and the awareness of him, the desire in the unspoken language of our bodies, was almost unbearable. I tried to breathe, tried to focus, tried to remind myself of the life I had, the man who loved me, the safety I could never risk. But desire is patient, and patient desire never announces itself politely. It lingers in glances, in the tilt of a head, in the subtle graze of a hand that leaves fire wherever it touches. "I should step back," the man behind me said softly, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile balance. And in that instant the tension twisted tighter, because I didn't want him to. Not yet, not ever. But knowing that wanting him, or him wanting me, could leave scars on the fragile framework of our lives made every second of yearning feel both sacred and forbidden. My husband exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, and I could see the restraint in his eyes. He wanted to reach out, to pull me close, to erase this invisible line between us, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not fully. Not yet. It wasn't just about the moment. It was about everything that came before it, and all the consequences we couldn't ignore. My fingers twitched, brushing faintly against the counter, brushing almost against him, almost touching a truth we weren't ready to speak. The brush was electric. I could feel the heat coil tighter, coiling around my chest, my spine, my every nerve ending. We were caught in the delicate gravity of everything unspoken, every hesitation, every glance that said more than words ever could. Desire, restraint, loyalty, temptation. They all collided in the quiet kitchen, wrapping us in a spell of longing that left no one unscathed. I almost leaned in, almost allowed the magnetic pull to erase the boundaries, but I didn't. Not because I didn't want it, not because I wasn't burning with it, but because the intensity of wanting was almost too much, almost dangerous, almost enough to break every wall we had built. So we stood there, silent, hungering, waiting. The kitchen seemed smaller now, the shadows longer, the heat thicker, and the unspoken truths between us more electric than any word could ever capture. We wanted each other, but the cost of wanting was just as heavy as the desire itself. The kitchen had shrunk to a heartbeat. Every movement, every breath felt amplified, as if the air itself had thickened around us. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the counter, trembling despite myself, while his gaze lingered in ways that made my chest ache. The man behind me hadn't moved closer, but his presence pressed against the back of my arms, a silent insistence that left me shivering with awareness. And my husband standing in front was closer than ever, his eyes holding a vulnerability I'd never seen, raw and unguarded. "I can't not notice you," he whispered, and the words landed heavier than a shout. My stomach tightened, my heart skipped, and for a moment the space between us seemed to ignite. It wasn't about permission, it wasn't about right or wrong, it was about the undeniable gravity of wanting, mutual, urgent and forbidden. The man behind me shifted again, subtle, like a shadow stretching. My arm brushed against his by accident, or maybe not. A spark shot through me, electric, almost unbearable. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence was more alive than any conversation could ever be. Each small sound, the hum of the fridge, the soft creak of floorboards, the subtle intake of breath, amplifying the charged intimacy in the room. "You're trembling," he said again, this time so softly it could have been a thought spoken only for me, and it was true. I could feel it in my pulse, my quickening breath, the warmth of my skin that seemed too keenly aware of both of them at once. The distance was measured, yet every inch screamed of closeness. My husband's hand twitched near my cheek. I wanted to reach out to him, wanted to close the small gap, but hesitation held me. Desire and restraint were entwined so tightly I could barely distinguish one from the other. And the man behind me, sensing the shift, leaned imperceptibly closer, almost grazing my shoulder. The friction was enough to send my senses spinning, leaving me dizzy with want and fear and something raw and unnamed. "I don't know how to stop noticing you," my husband murmured, and there it was, the confession. Soft, trembling, like a fragile spark catching in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt. Everything slowed. Time condensed into the tension of three hearts beating in sync yet in conflict, each of us holding back yet burning to act. A flicker of thought crossed me. What if I let go? What if I leaned in, even just a fraction, and allowed the space to collapse? But I didn't. Not fully. Not yet. Instead I froze, letting the electricity fill the void, letting the words hang in the air, charged and heavy. A faint exhale from the man behind me was almost a whisper of acknowledgement. The silence afterward wasn't empty, it was dense, saturated with longing, with a shared awareness that something had shifted. We hadn't moved, and yet everything had changed. The world had contracted into this small kitchen, into the fragile thread of tension and desire connecting us. And in that suspended moment I realized that nothing would ever be the same. We were all teetering on the edge, the air thick with everything unspoken, everything withheld, and everything we secretly wanted. And for the first time I felt it, the impossibly fine line between restraint and surrender, pulling us taut, waiting for someone to make the first move. The night had fallen, and rain tapped gently against the kitchen window, a soft rhythm that matched the pulse in my veins. The golden overhead lights were dimmed, casting long warm shadows across the marble counters, the hardwood floors and our bodies. It wasn't just a room anymore, it was a sanctuary of suspended time, where the world outside could not intrude, and every heartbeat, every sigh was amplified. I felt him there before I saw him, the man behind me, closer than ever, the warmth of him pressing into the back of my arms, his presence a quiet insistence that let me know he had been waiting for this moment as desperately as I had. And in front of me my husband's eyes held something I had never dared to see before, absolute surrender, a vulnerability that made my chest ache and my knees weak. Their breaths mingled with mine, slow, deliberate, almost in rhythm with the rain. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the night, the patter of droplets, the faint hum of the refrigerator, our collective heartbeat flood my senses. Every tension, every hesitation from before had melted into this singular suspended space where desire and care intertwined, creating something almost sacred. His fingers brushed mine, light as a whisper, but enough to send shivers racing along my arms. My husband's hand hovered, then finally rested near mine, fingertips grazing, communicating everything words could not. Our bodies spoke in unison, a language built on stolen glances, unvoiced confessions, and quiet understanding. The electric energy between us wasn't just lust, it was connection, trust, and surrender woven together. I tilted my head slightly, and our faces drew nearer, so close that the faint warmth of their breaths brushed my cheeks. I could feel it, the longings, the hesitations, the fires we had been keeping at bay for months, all finally released in this one perfect fleeting moment. My breath melted into his, soft and trembling, and the subtle press of his shoulder against mine was more intimate than any touch could ever be. The rain outside intensified slightly, pattering in harmony with the quickening pulse in my chest. Shadows flickered as the lights shifted with the storm, and suddenly the world outside didn't exist. There was only the three of us, suspended in this delicate equilibrium, where the heat wasn't physical but almost visible, an aura of emotion, longing, and relief. Their hands brushed against mine again, this time lingering just a fraction longer. It wasn't about possession, or dominance or control. It was about recognition of the desire that had been smoldering unspoken through every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of restraint. I felt it in my chest, my shoulders, the hollow behind my ribs, the way my knees almost gave out beneath me. We stayed like that, bodies close, breaths mingling, the kitchen alive with our unspoken words. It was the culmination of months of tension, longing, and silent confessions. The rain, the soft light, the warmth between us, it all coalesced into a perfect storm of elegance, intimacy, and raw emotion. And though no words were spoken, no conventional actions taken, it was the night we let ourselves feel everything fully, and nothing would ever be the same again. Morning light spilled softly through the kitchen window, pale and tentative, as if the day itself didn't want to intrude on what had happened. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with a fresh earthy scent. Silence hung between us, heavier than any conversation could have been, and every sound, the faint hum of the fridge, the distant city stirring, felt amplified in the fragile calm. We sat around the counter, not touching, not needing to. The space between us still held the electricity from the night before, though it had settled into something subtler now, a quiet intimacy that didn't demand words but required acknowledgement. My chest tightened with a mix of relief and apprehension. We had crossed lines, yes, but we had also spoken without speaking, touched without touching, and somehow emerged connected in a way that felt irrevocable. My husband broke the silence first, voice low and unsteady. "I don't know what to call last night," he admitted, tracing the rim of his coffee cup like it might hold the answer. "Was it desire? Regret? I feel both." His eyes flicked to mine, searching, vulnerable. It wasn't a question of blame, it was a question of truth. I exhaled slowly, letting some of the tension drain from my shoulders. "I don't either," I whispered. "But I know it changed something, between all of us." The words lingered, fragile, uncertain, yet undeniable. The man who had been behind me, leaning against the counter now, simply nodded, his expression thoughtful, eyes tracing patterns on the floor rather than ours. His presence was a quiet anchor, a reminder that what had happened was shared, and that sharing carried weight. Guilt was a shadow at the edges of my mind, but it didn't dominate. It was tangled with relief, fascination, and a strange exhilaration. We had confronted ourselves, our wants, our fears, our boundaries, and survived intact, perhaps even stronger for it. Just as the morning light seemed to settle, the doorbell rang, a jolt in the calm. We exchanged glances, tension sharpening once more. My husband's brow furrowed. Who could that be? I moved toward the door cautiously, heart fluttering. When I opened it, a familiar figure stood there, my sister, rain still in her hair, suitcase at her feet. She smiled brightly, oblivious to the storm we had weathered in the night. "I hope it's okay. I know it's last minute, but I needed to get away. Can I crash here for a few days?" The twist hit us all like lightning. Relief, chaos, and opportunity collided. Suddenly the fragile intimacy of the morning had a new context. Secrets and walls hadn't vanished, but the connection between the three of us felt deeper, tested and tempered by the night, now facing the challenge of the world outside. We didn't speak immediately, we simply shared a quiet look across the kitchen, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired and what it had meant. The morning after wasn't clean, and it wasn't simple, but it was real. Every heartbeat, every shared glance, every lingering thought told the truth. We had crossed thresholds of heart and mind, and nothing would ever feel ordinary again. And in that subtle tension, in the hush of the morning light, there was an unspoken promise. Whatever came next, it would be faced together, in some fragile, electrified harmony. The evening sun filtered through the living room windows, casting long soft beams across the hardwood floor. Everything felt slower now, each second deliberate, each glance weighted with understanding. The storm of desire, the tension that had held us hostage for nights and mornings, had begun to settle like sediment, leaving clarity and warmth behind. I sat on the couch, my hands resting lightly on my knees, while the man who had stirred everything, whose presence had been both a challenge and a revelation, stood near the window, watching the shifting light. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The quiet between us carried more meaning than words ever could. My husband approached slowly, taking a seat beside me. He didn't reach for me at first, only let his shoulder brush mine, a tentative promise. Our eyes met, a thousand unsaid thoughts flowing silently, intertwining trust, longing, and a fragile peace that had been carved from chaos. "I think we've found something," he said quietly, almost as if afraid to claim it too loudly. "Something worth keeping." I exhaled, letting the tension of the past days and nights drain from my shoulders. There was no grand confession, no dramatic flourish, only the calm realization that hearts could heal, that connections forged in fire could become warmth without burning. The man near the window shifted, walking closer, stopping just behind us. His gaze softened, not with longing now, but with quiet acknowledgement. The moment was no longer about temptation, about impossible lines, it was about recognition, about understanding that whatever had passed between us had changed us, had deepened the way we saw each other, and that sometimes the mere presence of another soul could leave a mark that time could never erase. My husband leaned down, resting his forehead gently against mine. The gesture was small, intimate, unspoken, but it said everything. Safety, trust, love, desire transformed into something quieter, steadier, more sustaining. I felt my heart slow, a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with choice. The man behind us offered a small smile, almost imperceptible, and stepped back slightly, leaving the space between us filled with peace rather than tension. We didn't need him closer. The story of that night, the moments of raw emotion, would linger in memory like perfume, subtle, unforgettable, a reminder of the fire that had been and the calm that followed. We stayed together on the couch, hands brushing lightly, breaths mingling in the soft light. No dramatic words were needed, no promises shouted across the room, just the shared understanding that love, desire, and connection could coexist with restraint, respect, and care. And as the sun dipped lower, bathing the room in gold, I realized that sometimes the most profound intimacy isn't about what happens but what is felt. The surrender to emotion, the courage to remain vulnerable, and the choice to let hearts rest in each other's warmth.